destiny. Don't know about you, but it takes courage to be up here. And I remember, when I was about 12 or 13, I must have been 13, and I was at high school, and we all had to do speeches, and there was a whole week of all this speech stuff, and we all had to do 2 or 3 things that involved speaking in front of everybody. And I decided that I would do storytelling. I was great at reading stories and everything, and I thought, oh yeah, I can do that. And I didn't really mind speaking in front of people. Like when I went to Sunday school, I'd be up there, like, here's me. And it was fine. But when the thing about this storytelling was you had 3 things. And out of these 3 things, you had to make a whole story. Well, I got my 3 things, and I sat there and I thought, and I panicked, and I thought, and I panicked some more, and I stood up in front of everybody, and I panicked a whole heap and ran away. So for me to be up here talking to you guys actually takes quite a bit of courage. And I don't know whether you've seen those storybooks where you get the story and you read it and you get to the end of the first page and you might actually have to read the second page, and then it tells you to decide. It wants you to decide, should you go to this page where the outcome will be one thing, or should you go to this page where the outcome will be totally different? And that's a bit like our life, isn't it? We get to stages in our life and we have to make decisions. And the decisions that we make at that time in our life may determine the outcome of our whole life. And that's a bit like what we're going to read today in the story of Esther. And so the story so far, it's about 490-something BC, that's before Christ arrived. And the king is King Xerxes, and he is king over 127 provinces in the Persian Empire, and he extends from India to Ethiopia. That's a huge, huge area. And about 50 years before all this happened, the Jews had been free to leave their captivity in this area and go back to their homeland. But obviously, not all Jews had decided to do that. Some of them had decided, well, I'm here, we've settled, things are going all right, so here we'll stay. So in the 3rd year of King Xerxes' reign, he threw a huge party. And some of you will have heard this last week, but I'll just recap for those of you who weren't here. He threw a huge party for all his princes and officials in the province. And the party lasted for 180 days. 6 months of partying. Yeah. But I think you get over it pretty quickly, actually. And then after that had all finished, he threw one more party for all the servants and everybody in his palace town of Susa. And that lasted for 7 days. And during that 7 days, he asked his queen, Queen Vashti, to come and parade herself in front of everyone. Now, I think that would have been against all the laws of his household, actually, for him to parade his queen and make her just some sort of bimbo in front of everyone, really. But that's what he was asking her to do, and she refused. And because she refused, she was deposed. And to cut a long story short, the search was on for another queen, because after it had all happened, Xerxes felt quite sorry for himself and really, really wanted some more company anyway. So the search was on, and he found another queen, Esther. Now, Esther was a Jewish girl, Her parents had died when she was little, and she'd been brought up by her cousin, Mordecai. And so he must have raised her from quite little. Now she was chosen as part of hundreds of women to go before the king and see which one he wanted. But she had a year of beauty treatments, a year of pampering. She had Haggai, who was in charge of her personal care. And she really impressed Haggai, and he gave her special food. Now, we don't know what that special food was or why it was. But if you think about it, the Jews weren't allowed to eat certain foods. So maybe, just maybe, it was because she was a Jewess that she was given special food to eat. And he moved her to the best place in the harem. And then she was chosen by King Xerxes to become the queen of Persia. Now, one day her cousin Mordecai, who was sitting in the gate, and he was part of the court at the time, heard a plan to assassinate the king. So he sent messages to Esther, and Esther passed on the messages to the king. And it was all recorded in the book of the kings of that time. And those people were put to death on poles. And that was it. Nobody heard anything more about it. And the person, Mordecai, who had actually uncovered this plot, nothing more was heard about what happened to him for a little while, until a little while later. And then a little while later still, Haman, now last week Gary called him a man, and sometimes I referred to him as Haman, so if I refer to him as one or the other, he's still the same guy. Now he was a son of Hammedatha, that's what we'll call him, the Agagite, and he was made prime minister over all the people, which made him the second most important person in the land of Persia. And he was given a signet ring. And that signet ring, when an order was signed, it was sealed with a signet ring, and that signet ring meant nothing could change that order. That was it. It was signed, sealed, and delivered by that ring. Now, all the people of the land, when Haman came by, would bow down before him. Now, whether that was like a Chinese bow, or, or whether it was a big bow, who would know? We don't know. But we know that Mordecai would not bow down to Haman. And even though from time to time his friends would say to him, "Why won't you bow down?" his only answer would be, "I am a Jew." Now, Jewish people would only bow to their God. You think about Daniel when he was told that he couldn't pray to his God. He refused to obey that order, and he prayed, and he was thrown in the lion's den. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they refused to bow down to the big statue of Nebuchadnezzar, they were thrown into the fiery furnace. They all refused because they knew it was wrong to bow down to anybody else but God. So, whether it was because he just didn't want to bow down to anyone, or whether it was because he was a Jew, he would not bow to Haman. And this made Haman angry. In fact, he went to the king And he told the king that there was a race of people scattered throughout the whole of the king's empire who were enemies of the king. They didn't even obey the laws of the land. And he offered the king 375 tons of silver if he would agree to annihilate all of them. And the king agreed, and a date was set and sealed with the king's signet ring. And that was almost a year. It was about 11 months after the thing was signed that this was going to happen. Now that's a long time to wait. And doesn't that seem a little bit drastic? One man wouldn't bow down to him, so a whole race of people is going to be annihilated. I think there was something more going on. And it was all to do with his surname, Haman the Agagite. Because years and years and years before, when King Saul was first king, he was told to go and kill the Amalekites and wipe them all out. Not only wipe the people out, wipe the animals out, the sheep, the donkeys, everything. Total annihilation, nothing to be left. But Saul, in his wisdom, thought, I'll just save the best. And that was going to come back and bite the Jewish people at this time. And so I think there was a bit more to it than just one Jewish person who upset Haman. But that one thing passed down from generation to generation to generation, the hatred of the Jews by the Amalekites was coming on this set of Jews right there and then. And that's what prejudices can do to all of us. I remember back in growing up in Merseyside, which is just across the water from Ireland, all the civil wars that were going on, all to do with Protestants and Catholics. And the Protestants hated the Catholics, and the Catholics hated the Protestants. And where I lived, this end of the road was Protestant, just because it was. It's just the way it happened. And that end of the road were Catholics. And for me to go to school, I had to go down that end of the road. But all my friends could go to a school that was at a different place, so they didn't have to go through this every day. But I had to go through all those Catholics to get to school. And what a performance. I'd have to sort of hide and run and try and get through back streets and alleys just to get to school. And the same performance coming home, trying to get off early to get there before they did. And it was just life. And you didn't know why. It's just the way things were, because that's the way these people had been brought up. They didn't know why they hated me. I didn't know why they hated me. I hadn't even talked to them. But they hated me because I was a Protestant and they were Catholics. And the two should hate each other. Go figure. What prejudices do we put on our own kids? Have you ever thought about it? Do we say, we're not talking to that person in the family because they upset me, so nobody talks to that person in the family or ever gets to know them? It's not because they upset this person, it's because they upset you. Prejudices. Pretty bad, really, aren't they? So, when we're saying, Asian drivers, sorry, Kemp, are we being prejudiced? Are all Asian drivers really bad? Or is it the one or two that really get in front of us and we put it on everybody? Prejudices are all over the place. And we have to be careful when we're bringing up our kids or talking to other people that we don't put our prejudices on them. I've lost which one it is. that one. So we're going to pick up the story in the end of chapter 3. Dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March the 7th of the next year. The property of the Jews will be given to those who killed them. And a copy of this decree was issued as law in every province, proclaimed to all the people, so that they would be ready to do their duty on the appointed day. At the king's command, the decree went out by swift messengers, and it was also proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. Then the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa fell into confusion. And I'm not surprised. You've just been told that you are going to be killed on a certain day, and it's not even going to be today. It's going to be almost a year. You've got a year of being anxious, a year of worrying, a year of not knowing what to do. And everybody who's not a Jew is going to kill you just because you're Jewish. And there the king is, sitting back, drinking his wine, not a care in the world, because it doesn't bother him, because it doesn't affect him. And if we were reading from our multi-choice book, this is where we'd have to choose. Do we run away to a faraway country and hide in the hope that we won't be found? Or do we stay and face the consequences? And whatever you choose will seal your destiny, will seal your fate. So let's start where we're meant to start, at chapter 4, and see what happens next. When Mordecai learned all about all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, crying with a loud, bitter wail. He went as far as the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. And as news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, there was a great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, wept, and wailed, and many people lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Queen Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was deeply distressed. She sent clothing to him to replace the sackcloth, but he refused it. Then Esther sent for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to her as an attendant. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was troubling him and why he was in mourning. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the square in front of the palace gate. Now, Jewish people mourn differently than we do. Being of the Western world, we tend to hide it away somewhat, not express our feelings. People say, "Oh, how are you doing?" We say, "Yeah, we're all right. We're getting there. We're okay." But not in the Eastern world, and probably not in the islands, and probably not of a Maori nature, because they're more spiritual, they're more in touch with their feelings. They put on sackcloth, rough clothing next to their skin, itched, scratched, irritated, horrible. They covered themselves with ashes to show that they looked miserable and sad and dirty. They wept and they wailed. They were very loud, they were very emotional. So there would have been a huge scene going on outside the city of Susa and throughout all the 127 provinces. And Esther was sort of cut off from all this. She didn't really know what was happening because news of it hadn't reached inside the palace walls. But news of Mordecai sitting there mourning got to her. And she was concerned for him. So not knowing the whole story, she sent clothes for Mordecai. Maybe she was a little embarrassed that her relative was standing outside the palace gate because he wasn't allowed to come inside the palace gate while he was mourning. Maybe she was a little bit embarrassed that he was in that sort of state. Who knows? Excuse me. But whatever the reason, he refused the clothes. Oh no, what do I do now? This worried Esther even more. So she sent Hathach, that's his name, one of the king's eunuchs, to investigate further and to bring her news. And we can be a bit like that too. Something's going on and we want to know what it is, and we can't quite put our finger on it, and nobody will actually tell us, so we investigate and we investigate and we investigate until we find the right answers. And sometimes when we do, we wished we hadn't even opened our mouths to find out anyway. But for Mordecai, it was his one chance to get his message across to Esther. And he had come prepared with everything he needed, and he was determined to make the most of this opportunity. So reading from from verse 7 of chapter 4. Mordecai told him the whole story and how much money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury. He gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of all the Jews, and he asked Hathach to show it to Esther. He also asked Hathach to explain it to her and to urge her to go to the king to beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Hathach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Then Esther told Hathach to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials, even the people in the provinces, know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die, unless the king holds out his golden scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. So Hathach gave Esther's message to Mordecai. The messages are going backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. So Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows, perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. For just such a time as this. Maybe the dilemma you're in is for just such a time as this. Mordecai's response was very profound. You will die anyway, regardless. That's what's going to happen. If you don't do anything, you will die. But if you remain silent, you may miss the opportunity that you have been put on this earth, in this place, for. Esther has a choice. Just like the books, do nothing, be killed. Or go before the king and risk being killed. What a great choice. What choice would you have made? What choices do you make when you face the hard stuff? Do you just turn and run? I'm off Just like me when I had to tell a story in front of everyone and I couldn't think of a story to tell. Are you impulsive in your decisions? Right, I'm going to do this right now. But you haven't actually thought it through, haven't prayed about it, just going to do it. Do you have a cause in this life that you're willing to stand up for? So many of them out there. Have you got a cause? Closer to home, is there somebody that you know really well doing stuff that you know they shouldn't be doing? Are you willing to stand up and say, enough's enough? Can you be courageous when the time comes? There's lots of stories in the Bible of people who are courageous. But they weren't born that way. Take Joshua. He followed Moses in the desert for how many years? And then his time came. And 3 times he had to be told, take courage, don't fear. Daniel continued to pray to God in the lion's den. He didn't have a choice. He was in there, but he had courage. Paul, when he appealed to Caesar, he didn't have to appeal to Caesar. But because he was where he was, he thinks, right, I'm here. I'm going to appeal to Caesar, even if it costs me my life, which in the end it did. This was Esther's cause. This was what her time in life was for. So she sent back this message to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Now this is where Esther's true character comes into being. She'd been brought up by Mordecai. From very little, he had taught her to obey him. So that when it came to the time in her life, when she was an adult, when she had the decisions to make on her own, she could still listen to his voice and be obedient to it. So she was listening to his voice again. Mordecai knew her. He had trained her up. And doesn't the Bible say, train up your child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it? Doesn't mean that in between times things might not be a bit right, but your kids will think back and they'll start thinking straight if they've had the training from when they're very little. He knew Esther. He knew how far he could push her. He knew which buttons to push to get her there. Push me into a corner and I'll come out fighting, but I'm not a fighter. But if you know the right buttons to push, you'll get there. But most of all, Mordecai knew Esther's character. He had brought her up. He knew that woman. And so she becomes obedient to him. But at the same time, he becomes obedient to her, because all of a sudden she is taking charge. She's saying, I'm in this position of authority. This is what I need you to do. Go and tell everybody that you know, that you can get hold of, that you can get in touch of, to fast and pray for me for 3 days, and I'll do the same. And then I will go and do as you've asked me to do. So as parents, we need to encourage our kids. We need to bring them up in a loving environment an encouraging environment. We need to raise them as God intended them to be, so that when they grow up, they will in turn raise their kids to be obedient. And if we've raised them in God, in that loving environment, then they are more likely to be following God later on in their lives. Now, if they've been in an environment which is constantly critical, constantly sarcastic, sorry, Stacey. And a really putting down environment, our kids are not likely to want to know us when we get older. So we have to think about how we raise our kids. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther ordered. So because nobody is born courageous, that is the moment in Esther's life when things turned for her. She went from fear to faith. She went from hesitation to confidence. She went from concern for her own safety to concern for the rest of her nation. When she was faced with dilemma, she made a decision, and she sealed her destiny and the destiny of the Jews. So Esther was obedient. Esther was courageous. Esther was also wise. She used a plan. She didn't just rush off to the king, fall before him, bawl her eyes out, and hope that he didn't lop off her head. No, she had a plan. She was methodical. She had everybody praying and fasting for her. And let's think about this fasting thing. Now, God isn't mentioned in Esther, or is he? You see, what's the point of fasting if you don't pray? The only point of fasting if you're not praying is to lose weight. And there was nothing to say that Esther was overweight. But when we do fast, we get closer to God. Our spiritual perception takes on a lot more of what God wants us to do. So by fasting for 3 days, Esther was getting closer to God. She was listening for what he wanted her to do before she made any decisions. And what did she do while she was fasting? She didn't just sit around. Now, there are different ways of fasting. You can go off to a retreat, you can be off on your own, and you can sit in a room all on your own and wait on God, and there's nothing wrong with that. But for a lot of time in our life, we don't get that privilege of going off somewhere for a couple of days. We have to do things and relate to God in our day-to-day life. And so while Esther was fasting, while everybody else was fasting, she was getting on with her day-to-day life. Not only was she getting on with her day-to-day life, she was preparing a banquet. Well, I don't know about you, but I find it really hard to fast. And if you have to cook a meal, well, that's it. It's like, ooh, carrot, ooh. End of fast. I can't stand in a kitchen and fast. It just, two don't go together. But Esther, she prepared a banquet for the king. How was she wise? She knew the king's love language. She knew that he loved banquets. He loved parties. That's how she became queen, because of a party. So she used this to her advantage. She also realized that she needed more than one person. She needed more than herself. And there's always strength in numbers. Where two or more are gathered together in my name, there I will be in the midst of them. And she had all the Jews that Mordecai could round up, praying and fasting with her. We all need support. In times of our life when there's big decisions to make, we need support. We need people around us who will pray. They don't know this unless you've asked them. So if you've got big decisions in your life to make, find people you trust. Get them to pray for you. Don't do it on your own. So let's start at chapter 5. On the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the golden scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. That must have been amazing. For him to hold out that scepter meant he was accepting her. Her head wouldn't be cut off at that particular point, and she could actually come before him and at least give her version of things, tell him what was wrong. That scepter symbolized the power of the king. And when he extended that scepter, he was offering her favor. God offers us his grace and favor. And we don't have to do anything except for say, thank you, Lord, I'm here and I accept it. Have you accepted God's invitation to you? Let's carry on. Then the king asked her, "What do you want, Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half of the kingdom." And Esther replied, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king." The king turned to his attendants and said, "Tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet as Esther has requested." So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. And while they were drinking, the king said to Esther, "Now tell me what you really want. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half of the kingdom." And Esther replied, "This is my request and deepest wish. If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask, please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. Then I will explain what this is all about." Esther is being used wisely and shrewdly by God. She understands the importance of waiting and waiting for God's timing before making her request. Isaiah 40 verse 31 says, "Those who wait on the Lord will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and not become weary." So when we wait on the Lord, we gain new strength. We might feel intimidated. We might feel put down. But God will turn our weaknesses into strength. We will mount up with wings of eagles. We'll get a different perspective of everything. When you go up to the top and look down, you can see the whole picture. You can see everything. I get so lost. I get really disorientated. So I never know where I am. Or, which is north, which is south, unless I can see the sun shining and I know what time of day it is. I'm lost. But if I can get a map and I can look at that map and see, this road goes that way and those roads go that way, then I can get a sense of where I am. And that's the same as when you rise up on the wings of an eagle, you get a sense of what's happening as a whole picture, and that gives you a lot more strength. When we wait on the Lord, we store up extra energy. We get our energy and our strength from him. And our determination to persevere will deepen, because we will walk and not become weary. Esther's walk with God was an exciting adventure. Scary, but exciting. She stepped into the king's presence not knowing what their outcome would be. But she had confidence in God because she had prepared herself before God and she trusted in him. Are you open to the unexpected? When you're faced with a dilemma, will you call upon God? Will you make your decision based upon his will? And will you allow God to influence your destiny? When you're faced with a dilemma, which page will you turn to in your book?